Have you ever been the one who always carries the burden, always steps in to fix things, always lends a hand, simply because you're the most reasonable child in the family? Have you ever silently sacrificed thinking that, if you just tried a little harder, everything would get better? But then one day you realize, they never really saw you as a person. They only saw you as a solution. This is not the story of a rebel. This is the journey of Harper Blake, the daughter who walked away from the role of the ideal child to reclaim a life of her own. She didn't scream. She didn't seek revenge. She simply closed the door. And from that moment on, every definition of family was turned upside down. If you've ever felt exhausted from having to hold everything together for others, stay. Because maybe you'll see yourself in this story. They didn't ask. They just decided. And like every time before, I was expected to nod, smile, and somehow make everything fall into place. My name is Harper Blake. I'm 28 years old, the head accountant at Grayson & Cole, a financial firm no one outside the industry has ever heard of, and I live alone in a small apartment in downtown Boston. No drama, no scandal, no debt. Every square inch of my life is the result of quiet persistence. The college degree I paid for myself, the job I earned through competition, the spotless credit score I've maintained, even the kitchen table I assembled with my own hands. But if you asked my family, they'd tell you I'm cold. Not because I yell, argue, or cut people off, simply because I stopped rescuing them from the messes they created themselves. I have an older sister, Madison, 2 years my senior, but always somehow trailing behind in life. Madison has a particular talent turning her failures into tragedies and blaming everyone else around her. Lost a job, toxic boss, evicted jealous roommate, missed bill payments. She's doing her best, and my parents, Evelyn and Gerald, never questioned it. They just adjusted, patched things up, and when they couldn't fix it, they passed the burden on to me. You're stable, Harper. You're lucky, so you can help. That's the refrain I've heard for years. Help pay for the car, help with rent, help bail her out. It was always help. And the rare times I said no, they looked at me as if I were the one severing family ties. I learned a lesson very early on. My value in this family was not based on love, it was based on utility. But even utility has its limits, and they were about to cross mine. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always followed the same rhythm, the same old casserole, the same round wooden table in the middle of the dining room, and the same suffocating atmosphere disguised as polite conversation. That evening, as I walked into the house, I sensed something was off. My mother, Evelyn, greeted me with a smile that was just a bit too wide, not quite fake, but clearly calculated. "You look too thin, Harper. Are you eating properly?" She placed a hand on my shoulder as if checking to see if anything had chipped. My father, Gerald, gave a slight nod and muttered, "Hey, kiddo," before turning back to his glass of wine. Madison, my sister, was already seated at the table, eyes glued to her phone, not sparing me a single glance. She had a way of avoiding me like a kid about to be called to the blackboard, knowing full well they hadn't done the homework. I recognized the signals. When my mother became unusually gentle and my father unusually quiet, it meant they were about to say something they themselves knew was unreasonable. We got through the salad course without anyone bringing up anything substantial. My mother talked about the weather as if she were personally responsible for it. My father kept pouring wine, and Madison poked at her food like it might bite back. I could feel every restrained breath, every sidelong glance. Then Evelyn set her fork down, gently folded her hands on the table like she was about to make a formal announcement. "Harper," she began in a voice too soft to be sincere, "your father and I talked, and Madison's been going through quite a lot lately. So, she'll be moving in with you for a while." That was it. No question, no asking, no negotiation. She said it as if she were offering me another slice of pie, as if my agreement was a given. I looked around the table. No one spoke. No one stood up for me. They were all just waiting for me to protest, so they could label me as selfish. I looked at Madison. She met my eyes for exactly 1 second before dropping her gaze again. My father cleared his throat, bracing for a debate. But instead of objecting, I gave a faint smile and said calmly, "If that helps Madison get back on her feet, I don't see any reason to say no." The entire room seemed to stop breathing. My mother blinked, caught off guard. My father let out a quiet sigh as though he'd dodged a bullet. Madison leaned back slightly, the corner of her mouth curling just enough to show the satisfaction spreading like moss on a damp stone. But no one noticed that I had gone still as stone from that moment on. No one saw that my eyes were no longer focused on the meal. They thought I had given in. They thought I had once again obediently become their ever-accommodating talking pressure valve. What none of them asked, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was whether I still lived at that apartment. And the truth was, it hadn't existed for weeks. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to lie to my entire family. This silence was built over years of forgotten sacrifices, of just this once turning into obligation, of cold embraces masked as responsibility. I came to realize that in my family, survival came with conditions, and being the strong one simply meant being the most convenient to exploit. I used to think I could endure it forever. I used to believe that if I just did well, did the right thing, they would eventually see. But they never saw. They only knew how to take. And when I started saying no, they didn't reflect, they got angry. I remember vividly the day Madison called me crying because her car had been towed. She had just landed a new job, a real job this time, and all she needed was for me to co-sign a loan to buy a new car. My credit score was perfect at the time, and I believed her. 3 weeks later, she quit. 2 months after that, the bank called me. That was the first time. Then came the utility bills at my parents' house after my father was laid off. The DUI they begged me to keep quiet. The countless small requests that never came with a single thank you. But when I started pulling back, when I began to say, "I'll think about it," instead of sure, their discomfort became obvious. They weren't used to my silence. They weren't used to being denied. To them, I wasn't a person with limits. I was a contingency plan in the shape of a daughter. One night, I sat alone in my old apartment, the one on Beacon Street I was once so proud to have bought with my own hands. I looked at the door and realized I no longer felt safe in my own space. Because every time they needed something, that apartment wasn't Harper's home anymore. It became our home. Just like my money, my time, my patience, always treated as communal property. So I called a realtor. I sold the apartment quietly, legally, without announcement. I rented a small place on the south side of the city, somewhere no one in my family knew about. I moved out in silence. No farewell, no explanation. No one asked. And I didn't need to say anything. Because sometimes when you grow up in a family that only remembers you when they need something, the kindest thing you can do for yourself is disappear, just long enough to breathe. The first message came on Monday morning, just a few hours after that fateful Sunday dinner. "We'll bring Madison's mattress over on Saturday morning. Dad's packing things up tonight." Not a single question. No confirmation of the address. Just an assumed certainty that I was still in the same place, still the same as always, ready. The following messages came one after another, like a one-sided conversation I had never agreed to join. "Madison's so excited. She's packing her books. Do you need me to help clean anything before we arrive? I'll mop the floor for you. She said she'll bring her own dishes, don't worry." The last message made me laugh, a dry, bitter laugh. Madison bringing her own dishes. She couldn't even wash her own in the last apartment, and now she was talking about independence as if it were some adulting achievement. I didn't reply. It wasn't necessary. They were speaking to a version of Harper that hadn't existed for a long time. The version that always said yes, always took over, always sacrificed to keep the family peace. but that Harper had disappeared along with the old apartment. I was no longer the electric fan left running all night in a house that never bothered to check the switch. They kept texting, kept making plans as if I were a stone wall still in place, still playing my usual role even without a response. But not this time. On Saturday morning, I left home early, had coffee at my usual spot, wandered through the farmer's market without buying anything. I kept my phone in my bag, letting it buzz 3 times before I even glanced at it. Missed call, voicemail. Then on the fourth call, I let it connect. My mother's voice burst through, no longer gentle but full of panic. "Harper, what is going on? There's a man here saying, 'You don't live in that apartment anymore.'" I said nothing. On purpose. So she could feel the emptiness, the uncertainty, the same feeling I had carried inside me for years, without anyone caring enough to ask. "You didn't tell anyone," she almost shouted. "You stayed silent. You disappeared." "Yes," I answered as calmly as if announcing it might rain. "I didn't tell anyone." Behind her voice were chaotic sounds, bags rustling, my father's voice sharp as a blade, Madison saying something I couldn't quite hear. "Harper," my mother whispered almost accusingly, "what is this?" I responded, my tone still. "Even I sold the apartment. A few weeks ago." A pause, like all the air had been sucked out through the phone. "You..." "What?" she stammered. I moved. Quietly. I paused, then added, "No one asked where I was living, so I didn't say." And in that moment they realized this entire invasion had been calculated to fail. They couldn't walk into my life like they used to, because this time I had removed the door from its hinges. They thought it would end there, a minor misunderstanding, a heated phone call, and then I'd explain, open the door, and go back to being the same old Harper. But they were wrong, because what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for years. They didn't know how many nights I sat alone in that old apartment, staring at the ceiling, at the bills I paid for them, at all the times I clenched my jaw through an unjust scolding just to keep the peace. They didn't know how many times I shrank myself, gave up personal opportunities, all because of the phrase, "You're the stable one, just help out a little." They didn't know. But now they were starting to feel it. That night, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, wine glass in hand, my phone kept buzzing. My mother, my father, Madison. Then a string of unknown numbers, maybe relatives, maybe their friends, maybe people I once called family, but who never once called me a person. The messages shifted from confusion to accusation. "Madison has to sleep in her car. You've really hurt your mother. How could you treat your sister this way?" No one asked why. No one mentioned the times I bowed my head, the money I silently sent, the days I bore the weight of others' mistakes. In their eyes, I was the traitor simply because for the first time I chose myself. I quietly opened Facebook, and just as I expected, my mother had posted a photo of Madison at 3 years old, smiling like an angel in a floral dress. 3 paragraphs wrapped in a broken heart emoji. "We raised 2 daughters to love each other, but it seems one of them has forgotten that." The post racked up hundreds of likes, flooded with comments from people unfamiliar with me, but close to them. "How heartbreaking. That girl is so cold. Poor Madison." I read each line slowly, without anger, without sadness, just like a stranger watching an old play with an all too familiar script. Then I made my first post in nearly 2 years. No explanations, just the truth. A screenshot of the $2,000 bank transfer I once sent to save their house. A photo of the car loan under my name with the delinquency notice, the lawyer invoice from the DUI case, a text from Madison calling me a boring robot after I declined to let her crash at my place the last time. And I ended with a single line. I didn't abandon my family. I just stopped volunteering to carry their unnamed emotional debts. I didn't need applause. I didn't expect anyone to understand. I just needed silence. And finally, I had it. I thought I had ended everything there, a clear refusal, a boundary drawn a necessary distance to breathe. But I had forgotten one thing: my family doesn't accept no as an answer. They don't believe in finality, let alone the idea that I might actually walk away from the obedient role they had cast me in for over 20 years. So while I was calmly sipping my Sunday morning coffee, watching sunlight pour through the window like a reward for the peace I had fought to reclaim, there came a knock at the door. 3 firm knocks, not rushed but heavy with restraint. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. They had come. Of course they had. Because to my mother, silence is a challenge. She needed confrontation. She needed to prove that no matter how far I moved, I was never far enough to escape obligation. I cracked the door open. Standing before me were my mother, my father, and Madison, along with a small moving truck parked at the curb, its back wide open, stuffed with suitcases and boxes like a carefully planned migration. "You found me?" I said, my voice utterly devoid of surprise. My mother's face was flushed, her lipstick slightly smeared as if she'd spent the morning wringing her hands. "We've been calling," she said, breath short. "We didn't think you'd actually move out." I finished for her. "This is my home. Of course I live here." My father cut in, his voice tense like he was reading from a prepared statement. "You said Madison could move in, and now you're standing here, acting like a stranger." I didn't flinch, didn't get angry. I looked him straight in the eye and replied as calmly as if reciting a fact. I said, "If it helps Madison, then I don't see a problem." But I never said where. And the old apartment, as you all know, is no longer where I live. Madison stepped forward, arms crossed, her eyes brimming with that familiar fury. "You're so petty, Harper. Always acting like you're above it all. But this is just cruel." I tilted my head, smirked slightly. "You packed up your entire life, loaded it into a truck, drove across town to move into the home of someone you never even confirmed still lived there. You didn't call. You didn't ask. You just assumed. That's not trust, Madison. That's entitled demand." My father stepped closer, his voice now sharp with threat. "That's enough. We're not going anywhere. You owe this family, and it's time you paid up." I looked at him, long and deep, as if I had finally heard the words they'd been silently holding for years, not a request for help, but a verdict. I was a debtor, a walking wallet with feelings, a smiling mask on demand. I stepped back, picked up my phone. "What are you doing?" My mother squinted. I didn't answer. I dialed. 3 rings. A woman's voice came through. 911. "What's your emergency?" I kept my eyes on my family. I have 3 individuals standing outside my home, not listed on the lease, not invited, and refusing to leave. "I'd like to report a trespassing incident." Madison's mouth fell open. My father cursed. My mother looked as if I had slapped her. "You're calling the police on your own family," she whispered, voice cracking. "I asked everyone to leave," I replied. "You refused. And that's your choice." And in that moment, as I recited my new apartment address to the dispatcher, I knew I was no longer their Harper. I was Harper for myself. And for the first time in my life, I chose me without apology. The patrol car arrived in just 10 minutes. A tall female officer stepped out, her stride, calm but firm. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the scattered boxes on the sidewalk onto my mother's bewildered face, my father's clenched fists, and the fire in Madison's eyes. I stood in the doorway, not angry, not afraid, just strangely still, as if I had just shed a heavy skin that had clung to me my entire life. "Good evening," the officer said, her gaze sweeping over each person as if scanning an open file. "We received a report of a trespassing incident." I nodded. I made the call. She looked at my family, then back at me. "Can you confirm that this is your official residence?" I answered firmly. "Yes. The lease is in my name. None of them have permission to reside here." My father stepped forward, his voice tight with restrained fury. "This is our daughter. This is a family matter." But the officer didn't flinch. And this is her home. Under the law, you have no right to remain without the tenant's consent. Madison gripped her bag strap tightly, her lips pressed into a line, then finally spoke. Not with anger, but with a hollow tone. You'll regret this, Harper. Do you know what people will say about you? What they'll think? I turned to her, meeting her gaze directly. Yeah, I said, my voice soft. Like a message on the wind, they'll say I finally learned to close the door. My mother said nothing more. She looked at me like I was a stranger, like a soul she didn't recognize. You used to be a good person, she whispered, eyes unblinking. You used to be the only one I could rely on. I didn't avert my gaze, but I didn't crumble either. And I used to think you saw that I replied. But it turns out I was just a tool, a pillar for everyone to lean on without ever checking if it was cracking. The officer asked the three of them to leave the premises. There was no shouting, just the sound of boxes being closed, footsteps hitting the pavement with frustration. When the moving truck rolled away, I stood there for a few more seconds. Night had fallen. The city continued to hum, but for me, something had gone still. I hadn't just lost a family, because the truth is, I never truly had one. I had just reclaimed myself. A Harper who no longer needed to justify, to endure, to strain herself to uphold a hollow form of kinship. And perhaps for the first time in my life, I truly felt alive. Not to please, not to be accepted, but simply to be at peace. That's all. I woke up the next morning in an apartment so quiet it felt strange, not the kind of quiet that comes from loneliness, but the kind you only experience when you no longer have to be on guard. No early morning message alerts, no one knocking at the door, no lingering feeling that I was living in borrowed space. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, not to sleep better, but as a small ritual to mark that something had ended. My phone kept buzzing, but I didn't rush to check it. I knew the rhythm of those calls by heart, first unknown numbers, then Mom, then Madison, then the long list of relatives who never remembered my birthday, but now suddenly felt entitled to pass judgment. When I finally looked at the messages, they lined up like accusations. Why would you do this to your sister? Madison is sleeping in her car. You broke your mother's heart. Not a single person asked if I was okay. No one mentioned the years I quietly paid off the family's debts with my youth and my trust. I didn't respond. I just scrolled, then paused when I saw my mother's public Facebook post. A picture of Madison at 3 years old, cheeks rosy, hugging a stuffed animal. Below were 3 long paragraphs punctuated with broken heart emojis. We raised 2 daughters to love each other. But one of them seems to have forgotten that. The post had hundreds of likes, tearful comments from people I'd never been close to. How cruel. Hope she comes to her senses. Family is everything. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I just felt tired. Tired of enduring a story told by people who never once cared to hear my side. And so I wrote. No explanations. No pleas. I simply posted the truth. A series of screenshots, then $2,000 bank transfer that covered the overdue rent, the car loan agreement in my name, with the delinquency notice after Madison stopped paying the attorney invoice from the first DUI, the old text where Madison called me a boring robot for not letting her crash at my place. I didn't add emotion. I didn't elaborate. I just laid out the evidence and ended with a single line. I didn't abandon my family. I just stopped volunteering to pay an endless emotional debt. Then I turned off my phone. Not because I feared the backlash, but because I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need nods of sympathy. I no longer lived to please anyone. I lived to protect the last bit of peace I had left. And for the first time in many years, I had it. Untouched, undisturbed, unrequested. Just me and a silence that didn't need permission to exist. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't jump up to check my phone. I didn't question myself, wondering if I had gone too far. I simply turned off the lights in my small apartment, living room, kitchen, hallway. Each switch flipped like shedding another layer of performance. There were no family portraits on the wall, no keepsakes to remind me that I had once been the good daughter. Just the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains and the hum of the air conditioner soft as a sigh. I sat by the window, the tea in my hand, now cold eyes looking down over the city. A man walked by with his dog. A young woman laughed into her phone. And me, not needing to play any role in their eyes, just a regular woman sitting still. My phone lit up once more. Mom. Then Madison. I didn't open them. I didn't need to read to know what they'd say. I had memorized their cycle: first shock, then anger, then the victim act. That was always the pattern. A loop I used to think I had no choice but to follow. But not anymore. I had removed my hands from that wheel. I no longer owed it to anyone to open the door just because they knocked. I no longer owed it to anyone to reply just because they messaged. Because not every door is meant to stay open forever. Some doors are closed, not out of hatred, but because finally I chose to put myself on the other side. I stepped out onto the balcony. The air was chilly, but not the kind of bitter cold that slices through you like winter's past. This was the kind that reminded you that you could still feel, still be alive. Down below, a neighbor waved when they saw me. I waved back and smiled. A small, simple gesture, yet heavier with meaning than all the forced hugs at awkward family gatherings. I didn't need to be loved on someone else's terms. I just needed to be seen for who I really was. That night, I went to bed early. No dreams, no tossing and turning, no more feeling like I was performing for an audience that never clapped. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel broken. I just felt done. No explanations, no justifications, no more trying to save a home I was never invited to own. They would tell the story the way they wanted. They would play the victims, cast me as the villain, the cold-hearted one, the one who didn't appreciate blood ties. But I didn't need to be part of that script anymore. I didn't disappear. I simply began writing a chapter of my own. And this time, I was the one holding the pen. You see, sometimes courage doesn't look like shouting your pain to the world. Sometimes it's quietly standing up, closing the final door, and never opening it again. Harper didn't need anyone to understand her, didn't need a crowd to take her side. She just needed to live in the silence she reclaimed after years of being used. Maybe you're in a family like that too, where love wears the mask of obligation and assumptions. If this story reminded you of yourself, leave a comment. Share a thought and experience, or simply say, I understand. And don't forget to follow the channel for more stories like this, where silence has a voice, and the ones who seemed weakest turn out to be the strongest when they finally decide to walk away. You're not alone, and maybe you've just begun writing the first chapter of your own life.